The Greenwood and the Dry. 8 Reflections by Primavesi during the Holy Week Good Friday service on the 14th of April 1995 in St James's Piccadilly. Opening Prayer. Spirit of the living and dying God, may the gift of your presence enliven us now and at the hour of our death. Spirit of the living and suffering God, may the gift of your presence encourage us to live and to die with dignity. Spirit of the God of life and of death, reaffirm us in our affinity with the living and with the dead. The first reflection. Those of us who have been fortunate enough to make the pilgrimage to Assisi will remember the series of 24 frescoes by Giotto around the walls of the upper cathedral. They depict notable events in the saint's life with a strong emphasis on the miraculous. Pilgrims, tourists and art lovers who go to the basilica in search of either spiritual or artistic inspiration, or indeed both, usually walk around the pictures in a certain sequence, one which follows Francis's own journey from conversion through to his death. Then they may go back and stand for a longer time in front of one. There are some more famous than others, for example, his renunciation of his father's wealth, or his preaching to the birds. But each one attracts us with its beauty, its poignancy, and its otherworldly air. Those of us who have seen the frescoes know also that only some of the pictures record actual events. This does not mean that the other frescoes do not tell the truth about Francis. They're records of what, 100 years or so after his death, people had come to believe were important about him, things which they believed corresponded to and expressed some important truth in Francis's life. They were and are a wonderfully graphic way of presenting this truth, of saying that his life had more than a single meaning. It had meaning itself. And for those of us who search for meaning in our own lives, Francis's life still has something to say to us. In Assisi, this calls for us literally to walk on a parallel journey with Francis, to understand his life by standing under the frescoes and letting them teach us, letting them rain their truth down upon us. This practice of both physical and spiritual pilgrimage, in which we accompany someone on his or her journey through life to death, is repeated in the devotion called the Stations of the Cross. The path is marked by 14 numbered crosses, which may or may not be embellished by pictures on the wall. If there are pictures, they show certain episodes on Jesus' road, the road from life to death. Some of them, as with Francis, depict recorded events, others do not. Today we shall walk this journey. We shall accompany Jesus on this journey with our hearts, with our minds, with our spirit, with our imagination. Each of us carries with us our cultural and religious history, as well as our personal histories. They too form part of each picture. Jesus' story is particular to him and to those whom he meets on the way. But there is a sense in which it is our common story, in which each of us will meet our own self on that road as we identify with one or other character. But whatever individual we identify with, we also identify with the journey itself. Reflection 2. The first picture on the way of the cross is that of Pilate sentencing Jesus to death, an event recorded in all 4 Gospels with the curt phrase, "He delivered him over to be crucified." Crucifixion was and remained a political and military punishment. It was widespread in the ancient world as an execution of extreme cruelty. It was inflicted by Indians and by Persians, by Greeks and by Romans, by Carthaginians and by Celts, by Germans and by Britons. It was intended as a deterrent against rebellion and was therefore as horrific and as public as possible. It was usually associated with other forms of torture such as scourging, and by the public display of the naked victim at a prominent place. So setting the cross at a crossroads or on a hill represented the uttermost humiliation of the victim. Truly, he was despised, rejected, one from whom people averted their faces. Death by crucifixion is the fact in the story of Jesus, recorded in secular contemporary Roman and Jewish history. Death is fact in our personal stories and in the story of the planet. Death is natural. The journey to death is part of the story of the world, painted not only in frescoes but in rock and in flesh, in vein, in leaf, in the green wood of every sprouting tree. Recognizing the common experience of death among all living beings is then an affirmation of affinity between us and every living being. For religious people, death is a definitive meeting point between God, the human person, and the living world. This sense of affinity through death is evident in the desire in some religions, such as Tibetan Buddhism, and the duty in others, such as Judaism, to be with those who are dying, to accompany them on the road we all must take. The desire and the duty to be present at the moment of death and to accompany the body to the grave. For most of us, that journey is relatively private, made in the company of a few friends, of family, of caring people. But as I said, crucifixion was intentionally a public death. So after Pilate had sentenced him, we are told that a great multitude followed Jesus on his way to the hill where he would be exposed to public humiliation. This great multitude included women who mourned and lamented him, and who followed him all the way. It is in their company, in this spirit of affirmation of affinity through death, that we follow their steps today, that we publicly affirm our kinship with Jesus, with all those who have died privately and publicly, and with all living beings, now and at the hour of our death. Reflection 3. Death is natural. It is not, as so many of us have been taught, a punishment inflicted upon us by God. But as we stand in front of the first picture where Pilate sentences Jesus to crucifixion, we are forced to protest, is this death natural? Jesus is punished by death as a political criminal. Pilate is the representative of Roman military power. Jesus is the representative of all those before and after him who are victims of military power. Death by crucifixion was considered so horrible and dishonorable that it could be decreed only against slaves and non-Romans. It was inflicted only for serious crimes such as murders, temple thefts, high treason, and insurrection. It was preceded by scourging, a punishment itself so gruesome that it often caused death. This is not a natural form of death. It is a deliberate human act against nature. Pilate's military power has been and is represented by all regimes which inflict torture and death on those who threaten them. Militarism today continues to exercise that power in former Yugoslavia, in Burundi, in Cambodia. It inflicts death not only on human beings, but on all life forms that surround them and on which they depend for existence. The evangelists tell us that darkness fell over the earth at Jesus' death, that the earth shook and the rocks were split. The bombing of Sarajevo, of Grozny, leaves a devastated landscape. Deadly nuclear weapons rusting on the seabed in the Arctic Circle, and cans of nerve gas dumped in the Irish Sea spread darkness today over the waters. Pilate represents another kind of power, the spiritual power of Caesar, a political image of God in which earthly rulers assume that they represent divine power. It is this which, explicitly or not, often legitimates the use of military power. Threats to that power are then summarily dealt with in the name of Caesar's God. So the charge against Jesus is couched in terms expressing a threat to Caesar's power. Jesus is accused of saying that he is Christ, he is Messiah, anointed by God, King of the Jews. Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you King of the Jews?" Jesus' ambiguous answer, "You have said so," is picked up again in the four Gospels when recording his crucifixion. Pilate himself, John tells us, writes the inscription on the cross, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Here we have two irreconcilable concepts of power, both claimed as divine, one of which triumphs over the other. The power of Roman militarism conquers the power of Jesus, the bearer of Jewish messianic hope, the king anointed by God to free his captive people, to give sight to the blind, and to proclaim Sabbath for all creation. "50 years after Auschwitz, 50 years this week after the captives of Belsen and Buchenwald were freed, we must ask ourselves how effective Pilate's conquest has been. Its implementation was begun less than 300 years after the death of Jesus, when we find the two concepts of power fused into one in the person of the Roman Emperor Constantine. The historian Eusebius records the moment at the end of the Council of Nicaea, when detachments of bodyguards and troops surrounded the entrance to Constantine's palace with drawn swords. Protected by this hedge of swords, the men of God, the bishops, proceeded, Eusebius says, without fear into the innermost imperial apartments, where some joined the emperor at table. One might have thought, Eusebius piously remarks, that here we had a picture of the Messiah's kingdom. Might we indeed? The Messiah's kingdom? Without the poor, without the halt, the lame, without children, totally without women? Is this the Messiah's kingdom, when bishops are guarded by Roman swords? How can Romanized Christianity claim to fulfill Jewish messianic hope when it embodies the powers which sentenced that hope to death? Whose idea was the Messiah? Was it not that of the Jews? For Pilate, that idea was treason, to be wiped out by military force. "50 years after Auschwitz, Belsen, Buchenwald, and Treblinka, have we Christians the right to proclaim that Messiah has come for us, when faith in the Messiah, we proclaim, has been used to legitimate the killing and torture of millions, in the Crusades, in the conquest of the Americas, in the Inquisition, in the pogroms that preceded the modern Holocaust? Were these deaths natural? What kind of God is supposed to have justified them as punishment for sin? Do we live in the kingdom of the Messiah, or in Pilate's and Constantine's kingdom of male, military, political, and ecclesiastical power? The fourth reflection. So we move on to the next station. That ecclesiastical term is itself of Roman military origin. At this station, Jesus, the man we name Messiah, steps out of Pilate's judgment hall and is laden with the dry wood of the cross. This is not the whole cross depicted in Christian art, but only the crossbeam, a stake driven firmly and in most cases permanently into the ground, served as the upright beam. But weakened by torture, Jesus could not carry that one beam. His first step takes us to the first unrecorded incident. He falls. So this is the Messiah. There are no falls recorded in the Gospels, but as in Giotto's frescoes, this is a picture that religious imagination requires. This is a picture which makes events somehow correspond to the inner felt necessity of things. In the Gospel accounts, we are given a picture, especially in John's Gospel, of a man in charge of events, of Jesus able to sustain every blow with dignity and to go to his death without stumbling. This is a Messiah who remains untouched by all that happens to him, who overcomes suffering and weakness, who hands over his spirit to God. But religious imagination, with its instinct for truth, would have none of this. If Jesus did not fall, then how is he one of us? If Jesus did not fall, how can we say he has borne our griefs? Is he too not overwhelmed by them as we are? On our road through life, the first fall is the first real self-knowledge. We learn our inability to shoulder the dry wood of responsibility, of duty. We learn too that we cannot get up by ourselves. We cannot face our own self-contempt or the derision of others alone. Such understanding of what it is to be human requires that Jesus too will fall under the weight of the dry wood and will be seen to fall. But there is a deeper reason yet why this must happen. If Jesus is to be Messiah, God's anointed one, then we have to ask what the word God means for us. Is our God untouched by suffering? Is God beyond the reach of pain? Does God burst out in sweat, break out in tears? Does God share our weakness in any real way? The theological question of whether God can suffer has not been settled by theologians, but the existential question of whether God must suffer in order to be God with us and for us is posed and answered in Jesus' fall beneath the weight of suffering. As the hymn says, his arms are spent. At this stage of the journey, a silent witness to this truth of Jesus' kinship with us in suffering appears. We have another unrecorded incident, demanded by the truth of his life. He and his mother meet. She sees what no one else in the crowd sees. Her child taking his first steps, falling, crying, having to be encouraged to get up and go on. Now she cannot lift him up bodily, wipe away his tears, clean the blood from his wounded knees. This is at the heart of her suffering, that she can only watch him suffer. This is at the heart of his suffering, that he cannot spare her that sight. In the realm of love, grief is no less than happiness. The measure of love is the measure of grief. The measure of grief is the measure of compassion, of suffering with the other. Compassion is the communion in suffering of those who love. Compassion exists because people love one another, and because it exists, it creates more love. In the realm of love, God is compassion, suffering with us. Alas, compassion is not the only reaction to suffering. Suffering can and does obliterate beauty. Humiliation and pain can degrade the noblest countenance, induce anger and impatience in those inconvenienced by it. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, for instance, there is in the reaction of the priest and the Levite an implied disgust almost at the appearance of the mugged traveller. So here, those who want to help cannot. The soldiers have to force a passer-by, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross with Jesus. Simon saw only 3 criminals on the way to die. He thought them no business of his. He didn't volunteer to help. The Gospels, all of them, say he was compelled to help, and Jesus was forced to accept this unwilling help. In this, too, he showed his compassion with us. The 5th reflection. The relief given to Jesus by Simon, however willingly or unwillingly, is enough for Jesus to raise his head for a moment. This brings us to the 6th incident, again unrecorded in the Gospels. A woman called Veronica sees his face and, driven by compassion, forces her way through the crowd and with a cloth wipes it clean of blood and sweat and dirt. Did Jesus need her to do this in order to be able to carry on? Is there any way in which God needs us? Teilhard de Chardin, reflecting on the cosmic Christ, the cosmic messianic figure, who for Teilhard is the unifying center of the universe. Teilhard speaks of the cosmic building up of Christ, of the Messiah. All around us, he says, Christ ceaselessly animates, without disturbing them, all the movements of the earth, from the lightest puff that blows through the air to the broadest currents of life and thought. And reciprocally, Christ the Messiah physically benefits from each one of them. For the Messiah, in Teilhard's understanding, the environment is more than the place where the Messiah lives. It is the reason the Messiah is alive. It is for us as it was for Jesus, in a profound sense, the reason God is alive in us and with us. So think of this scene as the cosmic building up of the Messiah, a gesture of compassion. The Messiah waits for that gesture. But the building up is not completed by one gesture. Hardly has Veronica wiped the dirt from his face than Jesus falls again. This, another unrecorded incident, is Jesus' second fall, perhaps due to something as small as a pebble in the road, perhaps a particularly vicious insult hurled at him. Anything is enough at this stage to bring him down. Now, when he is almost at the end of his tether, another instance of building up occurs, this time a recorded one. The group of women mourners gets close to him, close enough for him to speak to them. And he speaks to them at some length, surprising length given his physical state. He says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and your children. Behold, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, the wombs that never bore, the breasts that never gave suck.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if this is done when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" The reciprocal building up, the care for those who care. This saying of Jesus is not only surprising for its length, it also appears out of character. It appears out of character for him to refuse compassion from these brave women, because we know that he did not refuse anything from anyone, loaves and fishes from a small boy, and he defended the right of the woman in the house of Simon the Pharisee to weep over his feet and anoint his head. He had received the unwilling help of Simon and the generous gesture of Veronica. The name given to her gives us a clue about this incident. Her name, Veronica, means true image, true icon. And there is a tradition that the true image of Jesus was imprinted on the cloth she used to wipe his face. But what kind of face is it? Is it the impassive face of Aristotle's God, who, because he is perfect, needs no friends, no sympathy, no help from women? But if that is the case, what has happened to the Messiah who asked the Samaritan woman for water, who begged his friends to stay with him in Gethsemane? There is a desire to present Jesus as not needing any other strength, not needing to be built up by those who were with him on his journey. One of the reasons for this, for putting forward a claim that he rejected the sympathy from the women, is in order to make another claim that his suffering and death were unique, that he suffered more than and differently from anyone else. But as I said at the beginning, death by crucifixion was widespread. Jesus' death under Roman military regime was not unique in that sense. It was distinctive, personal to him. It was realized in all its agony by him alone. And part of that agony for him, as for each of us, is that we cannot share it in full with anyone else. But the manner of his death executed by the military, alas, that was and is all too common. This desire to claim uniqueness for Jesus' suffering has led to what one might almost call a cult of suffering, to a denial of pain in oneself and in others, on the grounds that ours does not count because we deserve it and he did not. Or the claim is made on the grounds that our suffering can only count if it is consciously united with his. Therefore, the suffering of those who are not Christians, who are not consciously or visibly united with him, is discounted. Or, in our cultural and religious and political history that we carry with us today, we know that in that history, suffering has been inflicted on the bodies, on the grounds that they are of no account. Only souls count. So we have a history of Christian complicity in the victimization of non-Christians. And during the remembrance of the 500 years of colonization in the Americas, this is one scandalous example of the Christian complicity in the victimization of non-Christians, excused supposedly by baptizing them. And if this has been done to our fellow human beings, what have we done to the dry wood of the other than human world? Jesus' apparent rejection of sympathy from the women can also be read, and is sometimes, as his determination to safeguard his dignity. However, from our point of view, Jesus' dignity, his sense of intrinsic worth, lies precisely in his fear of death, because a person without fear is deformed, is inhuman. Fear of death is a sign that a person is rooted in life, that such a person values his or her own life and that of all living beings. The sixth reflection. The desire to isolate Jesus' suffering and make it something different, something unique outside of the immeasurable suffering present in the world, is at best macabre. It becomes blasphemous when it denies his humanity, in particular his Jewishness. 50 years after the Holocaust, his words to the daughters of Jerusalem resonate with terrible truth. If he saw himself as Greenwood, the first shoots of a Jewish messianic consciousness, if that is how he saw himself, we know only too well what happened to the dry wood. The furnaces of Auschwitz consumed it. He saw the days coming when the daughters of Jerusalem would look for the mountains to fall on them and for the hills to cover them. Then we have seen that too in their desperate, unavailing flight from deportation and death for themselves and for their children. Jesus' death was a military operation. The Holocaust was a military operation. Jesus was sentenced to death by Pilate. We can see the Christian military machine at work in the Holocaust, in the kinds of denial of it, in the desire to erase it from Christian memory. It is part of our religious history. Its religious legitimation reaches back to the time of Constantine, to Constantine's infamous dream, in which he saw the cross as the sign that would lead his armies to conquer the world. Those of you who have the opportunity to go to Arezzo and look at another famous set of frescoes, this time by Piero della Francesca, will see that infamous dream depicted in a set of pictures where the cross is carried visibly, publicly, by victorious armies against any and all enemies. In our lifetime, that cross has been and still is embroidered on the robes of the Ku Klux Klan. We see that dream made reality in opposing Christian armies which hold that cross against each other, in which the dry wood of old hatreds between different factions in Christianity feeds the flames of nationalism, for instance, in former Yugoslavia. So it is not accidental that the daughters of Jerusalem still mourn today in silence for those killed by militarism, by war, by hatred. In 1988, a group of Israeli women, modeling their actions on those of mothers in Argentina who protested against the military regime there, these Israeli women started to hold weekly silent protest vigils in the central square in Jerusalem against the occupation of the West Bank. Identical groups were formed in Tel Aviv and in Haifa. Dressed in black wherever they stand, they are subjected to physical harassment, political abuse, and sexist insults, sometimes combined. So, for instance, these Israeli women are spat at by other Israelis, insulted as Nazi traitors, as PLO whores. In October 1991, a group was started in Belgrade. Women in black protest there too, silently, against war, against militarism, nationalism, ethnic cleansing, rape, destroyed cities, disrupted inter-ethnic and intercultural relationships. They stand for respect for ethnic, confessional, ideological, and sexual difference. In India, women in black stand in silent protest against Hindu nationalist violence and fundamentalism. These present-day daughters of Jerusalem, wherever they stand, wear black as a sign of mourning for all the known and unknown victims of militarist regimes. They wear black as an expression of resistance to war. They stand in silence since words cannot convey the depth of the tragedy, since words are used by warmongers to incite hatred, those who preach peace in the name of war. They stand in silence because the lives of most citizens are marked by silence. Their visible, persistent, non-violent protest is their way of telling political and military regimes, which have arrogated the right to speak on their behalf. They tell these regimes, "Don't speak in our name. We shall do that. I ask you now to stand in solidarity with the women in black. Reflection 7. We have come a long road since we set out on this journey with Jesus. Now it is time for us to reflect on the meaning of that journey for our future. If Christians had spent the time since Jesus' death on the cross protesting against this barbaric military weapon of execution, rather than in the interests of political and ecclesiastical power, turning it into a weapon wielded in his name against all living beings, then the present-day daughters of Jerusalem, the women in black, would not have so many deaths to mourn. The Crusades, those wars of the cross against our Muslim brothers and sisters, that cross casts a long shadow over our world today. If Christian theologians had spent the time since Jesus' death protesting against it, rather than glorifying it as a symbol of earthly and spiritual power, or using it to excuse Christian complicity in the victimization of non-Christian peoples and the appropriation of their lands, if Christian theologians had done that, then theology after Auschwitz would be characterized as protest atheism. We would all be atheists for God's sake. We would all reject concepts of God that support violence against the well-being of our sisters and brothers, against all forms of life. Our theology would be characterized by deep reflection on the mystery of suffering and God's place in it. If Christian writers such as Paul had protested against the manner of Jesus' death rather than spiritualizing its brutality, its violation of male human dignity, then succeeding generations of the daughters of Jerusalem would not have seen Jesus' words come true in their lifetimes, would not have had to weep for their husbands and their sons and daughters and for the degradation of the world that their children will inherit. If the fathers of the church had protested against the brutal manner of Jesus' death at the hands of a military regime, rather than scapegoating the Jewish people, we would honor the daughters of Jerusalem for their courage, their compassion, their vision of the value of their lives and of their deaths. Instead, in 1988 Christian commentary on the cross, on the Passion narratives, the only comment on this passage is a quotation from an eminent biblical scholar who categorizes these women as representatives of that element of Israel which consistently rejected God's messengers, that is, the prophets, Jesus, and the apostolic preachers. I find it very difficult to repeat those words today, with their horrific reversal of the truth about the witness of those Jewish women. I find them even more horrific in the light of a Jewish friend of mine, a woman who told me that one of her longest memories is of her grandmother, who every Good Friday would take her children, gather them around her and cover them with her arms and say, "I am so afraid of the Christian's cross. Today is Good Friday. Today is the day when they hold the cross against us." As a theologian, I find it horrific that her experience should be legitimated in a passage in a biblical commentary. But that distorted picture must be faced by us so that it can be wiped out with tears of repentance. Those women of Jerusalem, those women of Israel, those Jewish women who are imprisoned and in Auschwitz, they give us the true picture, the picture of courage and willingness to sacrifice their lives in order to mourn for the cosmic Messiah, in order to build up the cosmic Messiah, in order to be the bearers of messianic hope. The eighth and final reflection. One of those Jewish women at the time of the Holocaust, Hannah Senesh, wrote a prayer the night before her execution. It is for me an example of what Eliot names as prayer, more than an order of words, the communication of the dead, tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. Her prayer communicates hope, hope that her death and the death of Jesus, her brother, and all our deaths may kindle the fire of love, may kindle it even from the dry match, the dry wood of our religious history. I ask you to listen to this prayer as that flame is lit for us. Blessed is the match that is consumed in kindling the flame. Blessed is the flame that burns in the secret fastness of the heart. Blessed is the heart strong enough to stop beating in dignity. Blessed is the match that is consumed in kindling the flame.